Hey there, it's Lars. Thanks for checking out the Lars Larson podcasting experience, and have a fantastic day.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show, and welcome to a Wednesday on Honestly Provocative Talk for America. And boy, I don't need to provoke you very much. Consider what we're up against right now. We've got a Congress that is in a fight with the president over raising the government's borrowing authority, referred to on Capitol Hill as the debt ceiling limit. We are about to hit it. We're about to default on America's debt for the first time in history, and that is going on. And Joe Biden has doubled down and said, I'm not going to negotiate. I will not cut government spending in exchange for an increase in the government's borrowing authority. I hope Republicans stick to their guns. I also hope that America does not default on its debt. That has all kinds of consequences. Then we've got tomorrow, when Title 42, the device that was used out of federal law, it was in the law books for a long time before he ever used it, but when President Trump used it effectively to keep people from invading our country and brought illegal entry to America to one of the lowest levels it's ever seen in modern American history. And what is the Biden administration going to do? Title 42 goes away, and they are already anticipating. Today, in the last 24 hours, they've had 10,000 people illegally flood across the border. And I want to remind you, if you say, well, 10,000, what does that mean? I've got to set that in context for you. Back during the Obama administration, when Obama had talked about the evils of illegal entry to America, so had George W. Bush, so had George Herbert Walker Bush, even Bill Clinton talked about how it was unacceptable to let people illegally enter our country, especially in large numbers. And now the numbers are so large. During Obama, the Obama administration, Homeland Security folks were asked, what do you consider a crisis in illegal alien entry to America? And the answer was, anytime we have a number above 1,000 illegal entries per day. Do you know where we are right now? Over 10,000 illegal entries per day that we know of. Of course, there are the gotaways and the never-seens, the ones where you don't see them, but you know they got across, and the gotaways where the Border Patrol sees them, but they don't manage to intercept them. But of the ones we know about, 10,000 a day. In other words, what the Obama administration, I didn't like President Obama much, didn't like his policies, but he defined north of 1,000 entries a day as a crisis. We are now at crisis level tenfold. That's how bad it is. And then we've got this, the Biden crime family. And today, I've not been proud of the Republicans' lack of movement on a lot of things, on Capitol Hill especially, where they finally got a majority in the House of Representatives. And they said, we'll make good use of it. Well, today I think they did. They said, we've spent the last 100 days sending out subpoenas and gathering up bank information and everything else. And what did they find? They found a network of shell companies that were set up by the Biden crime family to benefit virtually everybody in the family. And they say this evidence directly implicates Joe Biden himself as being a bought and paid, they're not using the term, but I would call him a bought and paid for American president. Now, they say, listen, anytime you see a guy who is vice president of the United States and his family is out doing all these deals, most particularly James Biden, his brother, and Hunter Biden, his son, who are out cutting deals left and right in Ukraine, in Romania, in Moscow, and in Beijing. When they set up all these shell companies, the only purpose of all this convoluted finance is to hide where the money came from and where the money ended up. And they say all of it traces right back to Joe Biden himself. And I want to remind you, for the last half dozen years, we've had to listen to the mainstream media indict Donald Trump as a Russian plant. They did it over and over again. Some of them still do it today. And all of those charges, I might remind you, were not only proved untrue, but now we've got proof that those charges, Donald Trump is a Russian mole inside the White House, put there by Vladimir Putin, that all of that was engineered by forces inside the Obama administration, inside the campaign of Hillary Clinton, inside the FBI, and even inside the CIA, and probably other federal agencies as well. And the implications of it for average folks, American citizens like Carter Page, illegally wiretapped, General Mike Flynn, defamed as a spy and falsely accused of crimes we now know for certain he never committed. And all of that exclusively rigged by the Democrats and parts of our own government to fix an election. Those same criminals use false Russia claims to hide the evidence against then candidate Joe Biden, that he was bought and paid for by Ukraine and Russia and now China. And then a number of hours ago this morning, members of Congress stood up in front of the TV cameras. They're not afraid to answer questions like Joe Biden is. And they showed the evidence that millions of dollars, 10 million or more, from those countries buying influence from then Vice President Joe Biden came from top members of Congress. And let me remind you of something. One of the defenses that's been offered up of Joe Biden is they said, well, when he was done being vice president and before he decided to run for president, he was a free agent. He could go out and do whatever deals he wants. So all this happened outside of his public office time. No, it didn't. It turns out that these members of Congress today documented that a lot of this activity, a lot of the money was being transferred while Joe Biden was vice president of the United States. What do you think all those companies were giving money to a complete nitwit, ne'er-do-well like Hunter Biden, a guy who was coked up half his life, out fathering a baby by a stripper? I mean, not exactly something to write home about. Kicked out of the Navy Reserve for cocaine addiction. All of that was going on. Do you think that those Chinese companies like CEFC were just shoveling money to the Biden family? Because one of the most brilliant comments today, and I watched the news conference live early this morning, was from Byron Donalds from Florida. And he stood up and said, look, I used to be a banker. I'm going to paraphrase. I used to be a banker. You don't set up all these dozens of shell companies because you're doing legitimate business. You set up those shell companies to hide what you're doing, where the money is coming from, and where the money is going. And one of the brilliant things that Byron Donald said is this, that Donald Trump, for those of you who hate him, for those of you who, like me, love him, I thought he was a great American president. He'll make another great American president when he takes the oath in January of 25. But Donald Trump, if you said, did Donald Trump have a business? Anybody in America, even the people who hate him, would have said, of course he had a business. And if you said, well, what kind of business is it? You wouldn't have to be some reporter or very knowledgeable about politics to say, well, he had a real estate business. He had a hotel business. His name brand was worth something. He had a TV show. Those were his businesses. What Byron Donalds pointed out is the Biden crime family didn't have a business. What were they selling other than influence with Joe Biden? Well, Republicans have wavered about impeaching Joe Biden for his many crimes like wrecking America's energy sector and abandoning Americans and billions in military gear left for the terrorists in Afghanistan, crippling inflation, insane government debt. Republicans need to grow a spine, and for those who still identify as male, they should grow some other body parts and bring about articles of impeachment. I know he's not going to be convicted in the Senate, but it doesn't matter. August 49 years ago, the mere threat of impeachment forced out a corrupt president. They should do the same to Joe Biden. Back in a moment. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. I want to ask you something. If you had maxed out all of your available credit, you've borrowed from every bank that'll loan to you, every credit union, you've filled up all your Visa cards and your MasterCards and everything else, and then you went to your friends and said, hey, can I borrow a little bit of money? But I'm not going to change the way I spend. Would your friends loan you one thin dime? That seems to be exactly what Joe Biden is doing with our national debt, saying, I promise I'll get to cutting our spending as a government later, but I want additional borrowing authority now. Now, if I got any of that wrong, my friend Grover Norquist, president of Americans for Tax Reform, will set me straight. Grover, welcome back.
It's good to be with you, and I'm sorry to say that that is exactly what Joe Biden is doing. Mind you, 10, 12 years ago, Obama sat down with the Republicans, a Republican House, and he wanted $2 trillion, 400 billion, $2 trillion, 400 billion higher debt ceiling. And the Republicans said, okay, but then you have to alter your behavior so that your spending over the next 10 years is $2 trillion, 400 billion less than you planned. Okay, not a dramatic cut in half or anything, but take the increase you were going to and drop it by 2 trillion, 2.4 trillion. And he agreed to that, and things worked out well. Biden's position is he wants an unlimited amount of debt ceiling increase with no changes in behavior at all. He says after you give him the debt ceiling increase, he's willing to have a discussion about spending. But he was, I don't know, he was vice president for 8 years. He never helped. He was a senator, and all he did was look for more spending before that. And now as president for 2+ years, all he's ever done is ask for more spending. There's been no reform, no spending reform, no lessening of spending. The Republicans sort of say, the only reason you and I are in a room talking is because you need this debt ceiling increase. We wanted his leverage.
Yep, and that's what he's doing. So he has no history of cutting. He has a history of wanting to borrow more, even though, Grover, we've got sound bites we've run of Joe Biden from a few years ago saying, well, you have to negotiate on the debt ceiling. That's part of the process. And now that he's president, I guess he said, now that I'm king, I don't have to negotiate anymore. So he's not even stuck to principles that he espoused just a few years ago.
I'm not expecting him to behave better than that, but it would be nice if ABC, CBS, NBC, and the government's TV station, PBS, would at least pretend to be journalists from time to time and point out that his position today is the opposite of what it was. It's sheer hypocrisy. And instead, maybe some from Republican Senate, they would lead a story with Republicans attack the president instead of the facts are that they are. He had said this in the past himself.
Well, Grover, at this point, we have about 21 days until we hit that mark where we default on the debt, at least on some of it. Who's going to cave in first? And do the Republicans have a chance to force the president to change his tune? Because after all, they do ultimately control the debt ceiling and they control spending. So can they do that? Or is Joe Biden willing to play this out and say, I'm going to force the country to default on its debt with all the consequences that will come with that, and then I'll just turn around and tell Americans the Republicans did?
Yeah, he is going to have to rethink his strategy. Biden's strategy before was, I'm reasonably popular, Trump polls behind me, and the Republicans can't agree on anything, took him 15 votes to get a speaker. Since he had that thought in his mind and was refusing to negotiate or even meet with the Republicans, talk about being pig-headed, his own numbers have tanked even more. He's now losing to a number of the Republican candidates against him, including Trump.
Yeah.
And you saw McCarthy get 218 votes together out of a very narrow majority with a very solid proposal. So his idea that we would fall down the stairs and he'd stand there and say, you guys have to do what I want, that's not happening. So he is in a very weak position compared to where he thought he was 2 months ago.
Well, and Grover, I've tried, I like metaphors, so I've told my audience, this is like your adult kid who goes out and runs up a stack of debt, car debt, house debt, visa debt, whatever, and then comes to you, mom and dad, and say, Mom, Dad, I'm in trouble. I can't even make the minimums. That's about where America is about to be, is not being able to make the payments on the debt and defaulting on it. And you say, Mom and Dad, you got to bail me out. And Mom and Dad, I would say, reasonably turn to you and say, all right, son or daughter, we'll bail you out, but you have to show us, not after, but now, show us you'll change your spending. If you have 2 cars, sell one of them. If you live in an expensive apartment, get a roommate or move to a cheaper place. And stop going out every Friday and Saturday night and carousing around, and stop buying clothes or whatever it is that you're spending your money on. Change your spending. And if you won't agree to that, we will not bail you out. And that's something that every single parent can completely understand. And Joe Biden is saying, he says, no, the kid should be demanding that mom and dad give him a brand new empty Visa card and keep on spending the way they're spending, and then trust him that later on, with more spending authority, they'll actually spend less money, which, as you pointed out, doesn't seem likely at all.
He could sell, I don't know, a couple $1 trillion worth of student debt to the banks, come up with the cash. There's any number of things he could do that where a lot of people owe the government money. He could sell those loans, and again, he could reduce promised spending in the future that hadn't yet happened. That would count. Okay, if you put a serious cap on spending, and there's a bunch of money that was passed 2+ years ago because there was an emergency on COVID, if you remember, that still hasn't been spent yet. Tens of billions of dollars there. Take that money and start agreeing we're not going to spend that. There's a bunch of easy stuff that he could be, if you're trying to lighten the ship, there's a bunch of stuff you can throw off out of the ship into the ocean to lighten it, sell stuff off, agree not to, that money which we've appropriated and said we're going to spend, we're not spending it now. Lots can be done. Are they going to give the Republicans $4 trillion in spending restraint to make up for the $1.4 trillion in debt ceiling? I think we get $4 trillion, but I'm glad they're asking for $4 trillion to start with because it gives us something to talk about. And lots of presidents say, see, I wasn't completely rolled over.
Grover, it sounds like we lost our connection, but I appreciate the call. That's Grover Norquist, the president of Americans for Tax Reform. I know that was tough to hear, but I understand. I just wanted you to get his perspective on this. And this is the kind of thing I'd love to get a naysayer call on. We have, for more than a quarter century, invited naysayers to go to the head of the line. If somebody thinks that Joe Biden is right to tell the Congress, which, according to the Constitution, Congress controls spending, and according to the law, Congress controls the debt ceiling. And Joe Biden is trying to say, he calls it a clean debt ceiling increase. What he means is, I want the borrowing authority of the United States to be increased without any kinds of cuts at all, even though the cuts ultimately are up to the U.S. Congress. But we know how that works out. The Congress writes all the appropriations bills. That's how they say we're going to spend this money over here and we're going to spend that money over there. But presidents have before said, I'm not signing a budget if you send it to me without this, that, and the other thing in it. Joe Biden clearly wants to spend more money than the government takes in. And I'll remind you of the latest number I saw today, and that is in the last 7 months, the first 7 months of the government's fiscal year, which begins October 1st for whatever reason. Their financial year begins on October 1st. In 7 months, Joe Biden has run a $928 billion, not quite $1 trillion in spending deficit, and yet he claims he's got more spending restraint than any other American president you've seen. I'll get to your phone calls and emails next, and we'll talk about the decision against Donald Trump yesterday in a New York court. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show on this Wednesday. I got to tell you something. Tucker Carlson is launching a brand new show on Twitter. Carlson accuses Fox of fraud and breach of contract. He's made a host of document demands that could precede legal action. I think Tucker Carlson's going to be laughing all the way to the bank. I know him only in passing and not well. He's been on the show before, but he, I think, is going to do just fine over at Twitter, financially and otherwise. And I think he's probably going to win his suit against Fox. And it serves them right. Fox abandoned its conservative principles a long time ago, and I abandoned Fox a long time ago as well. Anyway, glad to have you with me on the show. Our Twitter poll today: what are the chances that all 3 children in one family are, and I'll use the word of their mother, queer? Marcia Gay Harden, who's an Oscar-winning actress, has proudly announced that all of her kids are queer at a digital fundraiser. Her word, not mine. And she said she showed up at a digital fundraiser in a live telethon to raise money in support of drag queen performances around the country. And we've certainly talked about that and how it's inappropriate for children. During a telethon called Drag Isn't Dangerous, the 63-year-old actress said she was there to help raise money to fight so-called anti-LGBTQ legislation. I don't think it's that either, because of her offspring. She says, what drives me is my children are all queer. And you say, what are the chances that all 3 kids in one family are gay? I don't think it's very high. You could say totally normal or a product of indoctrination. Answer the Twitter poll any way you like, at Lars Larson Show and at LarsLarson.com. Brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in. I join, you should too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC's better. Better for you and better for America. Now, last night, and I got a lot of negative email about that. That's okay. It goes with the territory. I pointed out that Robert De Niro has just had his 7th child. And if you say, Robert De Niro, isn't he kind of old? He's 79 years old. And I got to thinking, because I grew up with older parents, and I don't think it's the most desirable situation for kids. I mean, if you have parents who are not, as mine were, 40-plus years older than me, love my mom. My dad was an alcoholic, but there's that too. But should anybody that old be making babies? Because when I saw that he was 79, I thought when his child, his latest child, is 16 years old, he or she will be 16, and dad will be 96 years old. Is that healthy for the kid? Does that give you the proper relationship with mom or dad? I said no, so did 86% of you. 24% of you, though, said yes. And I got a few emails from people who are angry. Why did you even bring this up? I said I'd bring it up in a number of situations. I mean, let's say you had a mom and dad, and either mom or dad said, by the way, my job takes me to the other side of the planet, and I'm going to be there for several years while my kids are growing up. I'd say, I don't think that's appropriate either. I think parents need to be with their kids. I think kids absolutely need the guidance of their parents, and they get a lot of important things. I got important things even from my dad, despite all his deficits, and from my mom as well. If you don't have your mom or dad, and since Robert De Niro is 79, do you think that his daughter will still have dad when she graduates from high school 18 or 19 years from now? The statistics say it's not likely. So is that good for the kid, that you have a kid because you want to have a kid? And many times people do have kids because they desire to be a mom or dad. You say, well, what about the kid? What is best for the kid? And I said no, like 86% of you. In any case, glad to get your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. Let's go to Alan first. Hey, Alan, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind?
Oh, thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
I just was wondering that there hasn't been a lot said, at least I haven't heard it, about exactly why they're spending all of this money. Why it's not. There's not even a logical excuse for it.
Well, there is and there isn't. It's not so much logical, Alan, as it is political. You're talking about federal government spending, right?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to put you in charge of the budget for the next, 60 or 90 seconds. All right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Do you want to cut the military?
No, I don't want to cut the military.
Okay,
no.
Very good. Let's move on to the big dollar items. 2/3 of the federal budget is made up of what are called entitlements, and most of that is Social Security and Medicare. Do you want to cut those?
Not really, but something. I really don't. You understand that.
No, I get that. You're probably a Social Security and Medicare recipient. So you say, I don't want to cut the program that benefits me. I understand that. Everybody should look out.
No, I would cut it. I would.
You would cut it.
I'm on it.
Okay, whose grandma loses part of her Social Security check or Medicare?
Well,
card?
I don't. Yeah, again, I don't want anybody to lose any money.
Well, they're going to. You wanted to cut the budget.
Well,
I'm giving you the choices.
I understand that, but no, the budget that they're that Biden is not okaying the height.
They haven't even got to the budget yet. Think of it this way, Alan. When they talk about the debt ceiling limit or government borrowing authority, those are hard to understand. Do you have a Visa card, for example?
No.
You don't. You don't have any credit cards?
No.
Okay. If you had a credit card, and the government has a massive credit card that currently has almost $32 trillion charged to it, should we give them a bigger credit card to borrow more money to keep on spending more money than they take in?
Mm-hmm.
Should they?
Right. Not really, but
then you have to cut something.
Right.
And what do you want to cut? Because 2/3 of the budget is entitlement programs.
I believe the whole reason that Biden is doing what he's doing that shouldn't be done and shouldn't have been doing, spending all the money as he has.
Also of other
what
presidents.
he's doing is he's emptying everything that all of our credit, all of our money, basically, in the country, to where they can take over and force.
I couldn't agree with you more, but that's kind of a separate issue. It's a separate issue, and here's why. The previous presidents, previous to Biden, racked up about $30 trillion in debt. They filled most of the credit card. And Biden is responsible for about the last $2 trillion of debt that's sitting on that credit card. So I can't blame it all on him. And the spending was going on a spending beyond their means. Now, you know what that is. You probably know how much money you take in every month, and you spend less than that amount, right?
Right.
The government has almost never, it has happened a couple of times, has almost never spent less than it takes in. Now, what happens to an individual or a company that, say, takes in $50,000 a year but spends $60,000 a year? What happens to them?
They have to lay somebody off.
No, they go bust. Yeah, but eventually, if you're taking in 50 and spending 60, or you're taking in 5 million and spending 6 million, eventually you go bust. And that's where Joe Biden seems to be taking us. And I agree with you. He's probably doing it to serve a political end, that he doesn't mind if America goes bust, because then he and his globalist friends can make all kinds of changes that Americans would never go for otherwise. Alan, thanks so much. I appreciate the call. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you on a Wednesday, and always glad to get to your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. You know, we've talked on this program a bit over the last couple of months about the so-called Chevron doctrine, and I'm sure that Adi Danar will correct me if I'm wrong about this. He's an attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation, but since I'm a non-attorney, the way I'd put it is this. The Chevron doctrine says that if Congress sets up an agency, think, say, EPA or Health and Human Services, and then the administration, the bureaucracy says, hey, we're going to create a bunch of rules, that those rules, unless they go clearly outside the authority given to the agency by Congress, the rules have the force of law, and the courts will not question that. Adi, did I do a halfway decent job of describing that?
Lars, you did an excellent job.
So tell me about this. Is the Supreme Court going to finally reverse this nonsense and get rid of it?
We think it will, because the court had multiple options to review this particular question. This question has been put up for the court's review for the past 40 years. And this time the court decided to take the case and review this Chevron deference doctrine. And because it rejected the other question that was part of the case, we think that its grant of the question of whether the court should overrule Chevron is what the court is interested in, and we hope that the court overrules Chevron.
Let me ask you something, because every time I try to imagine how this works and why they originally made this so-called accidental landmark, let's say that you got an agency like the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Okay. And they set standards for the thickness of tire tread on American cars, which is probably something they do set a standard for. And they have a bunch of scientists and engineers, and they say the tire tread ought to be, a minimum of 72 millimeters thick. I don't think the Congress needs to mess with really little itty-bitty things like, should it be 72 millimeters or 74 millimeters or 69 millimeters? That's what you expect bureaucracies to do. How do we go from saying we're going to establish NHTSA and they're going to set tire standards and that's going to be set by the bureaucracy, and all the nitty-gritty details, like Federal Fish and Wildlife says what kind of hook you can use to catch fish in a given stream in a national park or whatever. Those little nitty-gritty details, the bureaucracy, take care of that. How do we go from there to agencies like EPA saying, we're going to go out and tell people you can't build a house on land you own because part of it is wet, 10 days every year? Because that's where we got to. How is it that the agencies themselves didn't say, look, we've got lots of great ideas, but if it comes down to big changes that have a big impact, not the size of fishing hooks or the thickness of tire tread, how do these agencies get the idea that, hey, we can write any rule we want?
So, Lars, that is a very good question. So what the problem occurred because, first of all, the Congress did not write clear statutes. They wrote statutes that essentially said, do everything that is necessary to implement this new program that we are enacting. And the agencies saw that as sort of an open-ended grant of authority to the agencies and started using this sort of, in the agency's view, a muscular power to do everything that is necessary to implement something. That's why we went from, 69 millimeter tire tread to them deciding, what sort of cars, what sort of fuel in cars that the industry should use. So the agencies latched onto vague statutes that the Congress wrote and expanded their own authority by really misusing and abusing the power that was given to them by Congress. And the second part of the equation is that the Department of Justice realized the potential for a sleeper case like Chevron, which at the time in 1984, when it was decided, it was meant to be a sleeper case. But the Department of Justice realized the potential in the case, and in every single lawsuit in which the agency's authority was challenged by industry groups, by private parties, the Department of Justice made a concerted effort to push the courts to adopt Chevron deference. And they were very successful in many courts, the most prominent one being the D.C. Circuit, which is popularly known as the second highest court in the land because it deals with hundreds, if not thousands, of these administrative cases.
Right. And do you think part of the problem here, I'd like the Supreme Court to fix this, but could part of it have been addressed if the Congress had done its job? And every time an agency wrote some cockamamie regulation that where they seized onto power they really didn't have, call the agency head up in front of Congress, grill them, and tell them to knock it off.
Yes, and there are tools that Congress can use right now, like the Congressional Review Act, under which they can disapprove of the rules that the agencies pass. But the experience with an act like Congressional Review Act is, Congress, because of political deadlock or what have you, almost never uses that tool to disapprove of the agency rules. So then the onus falls on courts and parties to bring up these kinds of arguments in court. And the experience, again, with that, we have seen hundreds, if not thousands, of cases have been, we have seen widespread devastation caused by the Chevron doctrine that the lower courts have applied for the past 40 years.
Yeah, and the end result, I'd remind people that agencies like CDC, agencies like FDA, that once they get that kind of authority and Congress won't question them, they say, oh, let's make birth control pills over the counter, or let's do this, or let's do that. And I'm sure Congress is happy to say, oh, you guys take on all those thorny issues because then we don't have to vote yes or no on them, and we have a better chance of being reelected and staying popular with our constituents. How soon is the case being heard on May 1st, right, Adi?
So May 1st is when the court decided to take the case. It will be a few months until the court hears argument and the parties file the briefs and the court issues a written opinion. We expect this by sometime June of next year.
Okay.
But I think you touched on an important point, Lars. We saw this recently with the COVID mandates. The authority that the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, claimed. The statute merely said CDC can look at fumigation and disinfection of articles that cross interstate commerce.
And that's where they went off to the races. Adi Dinar from the Pacific Legal Foundation. Adi, thank you. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Wednesday, and it's the day that members of Congress rolled out a lot of the evidence, not all of it by any stretch of the imagination, that show that Joe Biden, the big guy, and the Biden crime family were cleaning up big time. $10 million or more that flowed to the Biden crime family, and it clearly implicates Joe Biden himself. And Republicans from the House side were not shy about saying it at all, including Byron Donalds, including James Comer, including Jim Jordan, and others who've said, look, this crime family, the money laundering that was going on, the shell companies, 16 of the 20 shell companies owned by the Biden crime family were set up, 16 of the 20, during Joe Biden's time as vice president. So where many people have said, well, Joe Biden quit being president or vice president for years before he ran for president of the United States. So it must have happened during that time. No, it did not. An awful lot of the monies were paid while Joe Biden was sitting in the vice president's office. It's very clear that the Biden crime family was selling influence, and the influence they were selling was from Joe Biden. So for Joe Biden to deny that he knows anything about it, that any of his family got money from foreign nationals after 2020 is a bald-faced lie. And let me point out a big difference between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Donald Trump yesterday in a New York court was found guilty of sexual abuse, but not rape. He was also found guilty of defamation. And he's taking questions about it today. Do you see Joe Biden being willing to take questions about his crime family's activities anytime in the near future? Because I do not. In any case, glad to have you with me on a Wednesday. I want to tell you what else we're going to talk about in a moment. You want border security? Then you have to take away the incentive to come to the United States. And I'll tell you about a bill right now, a Senate bill that was supposed to or should do this if we actually saw it at the federal level. Instead, it's a Senate bill in Florida. And I'll tell you about it. If we adopted this same kind of approach on a national level, I think we would see some actual results. Instead, we have the expiration of Title 42 tomorrow. And we have the Biden administration and its Customs and Border Protection already admitting that they have, in the last 24 hours, apprehended 10,300 illegal aliens who've crossed the border in a single day. And if you think, well, those people are all being locked up, aren't they? No, you're not going to lock them up. 10,000 a day? What kind of facility would it take to lock up a week's worth of the illegal invasion that Joe Biden has fostered and aided and abetted? A prison camp big enough to take 70,000 people? Are you kidding me? No, that's not going to happen at all. First, let me tell you what's coming up this hour, and let me remind you about our Twitter poll. With the expected influx of illegal drug trafficking in America, which is one of the byproducts of Joe Biden's open southern border, should Congress impose stricter penalties on drug criminals who possess enough fentanyl to cause mass casualties in a single American city? Did China, or does China, execute millions of prisoners, religious prisoners, for organ harvesting every year? We're going to explore that as well. What changes are necessary to reduce the increasing crime rates that we're witnessing all across America? And take a chance, take a moment, if you don't mind, cast a vote in our Twitter poll. You're going to find it two different places: on Twitter at Lars Larson Show and on our website at larslarson.com. What are the chances that all three children in one family would be gay? I would say the chances would be very low, but I cite that Oscar-winning actress Marcia Gay Harden proudly announced that all her kids are, her word not mine, queer. She did it at a digital fundraiser and live telethon to raise money in support of drag queen performances around the country. The telethon was called Drag Isn't Dangerous. Well, if it's an adult show, whatever you want to do, you want to dress up in women's clothing, go right ahead. Whatever floats your boat. But if you're going to do drag queen story hour at the local elementary school or the local library, no way, no how. There is no reason that any adult, I don't care what your sexuality is, I don't care how you like to dress, what possible reason could there be for exposing children to a man in a dress or a woman made up to look like a man? Doesn't make any sense. So answer the Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in, so I joined years ago. You can too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC's better. Better for you and better for America. Now, yesterday's poll had to do with the fact that it occurred to me, since I grew up with parents who were in their 40s when I was born, which means they were literally old enough to be my grandparents. Not very old grandparents, but grandparents all the same. And did I think it was always the best thing to have a much older mother and father? I loved my mother to this day, and she passed more than half a century ago when I was about 10 years old. My dad was a drunk, and but despite that, I think kids get something important from their parents. So when Robert De Niro, who is 79 years old and will be in his mid-90s when his latest child becomes a teenager, I thought, is that really good for the kid? Because I don't care if Robert De Niro is capable of producing children. Clearly he is. I don't care if he wants to have a child. Lots of people want children for wrong reasons. And let me give you an example. I knew a couple. I knew both of them. They worked in my same industry. They decided that because their marriage was troubled, they'd have a child because that would glue their marriage together. Let me give you a pro tip. It didn't work. And they had a wonderful child. I've met him. I don't see them much anymore. One of them has passed away. The other one I don't see much anymore. But the fact is, I don't think people should have kids to glue their marriage together. I don't think people should have kids as a tax deduction. I don't think people should have kids to satisfy their own desires. You should have children because they're a blessing from God, and that it is your job as an adult to do everything you can to give them the proper upbringing and to make sure that they know that they're loved by mom and dad. Well, if dad is already 79 when his latest child is born, in De Niro's case, and he's going to be 96 or 97 years old when his latest child is a teenager. And statistically, we know that he's not likely to be around for much of his child's growing up time. I think that's cheating the child. And anything that adults do to satisfy their own desires that cheats the child, I think you're wrong. That's just my opinion. There it is. So I asked that question, should anybody as old as De Niro be making babies? 76% of you said no. 24% of you said yes. In any case, glad to have you with me. And a shout out to our friends in Susanville, California, KSUE, AM 1240, Chris and Andrea in the mornings. You can hear great talk radio and other great things on KSUE, and you can hear this show in the evenings on KSUE AM 1240. Glad to have you with me on a Wednesday night. Coming up in a moment, it's no secret China does a lot of shady things, but does that include organ harvesting from people who are locked up because of religious crimes? We're going to talk about the details of that coming up next. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you on a Wednesday. Now, what's not a pleasure is that mainland communist China, not the people of that country, because I think they're the victims of an evil dictatorship, but the things that country allows and even prospers as a result of are deeply disturbing. Not just the virus research that may have set loose a major pandemic on the world and their unwillingness to take responsibility, not just their intellectual property theft, and also their knockoff theft from various people around the world, including those in the United States. But consider this. Is it possible that China locks people up for what amount to religious crimes? Because, as you know, communist societies are not very friendly toward religion at all, and then decides to harvest organs from some of those locked up prisoners and harvest them while the prisoners are still alive. I thought I'd talk about this with a young lady who's broke the story. Susan Crabtree is a political correspondent for Real Clear Politics and a White House reporter. Susan, welcome back to the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Lars.
Tell me what we know about China's organ harvesting, because here in the United States, you want to offer to donate your organs after you pass, you can do it. You don't get any compensation for it. There's no money exchange. In fact, that's illegal in the United States. And yet in China, this seems to be a national industry that the government actually participates in.
Yes, there are a lot of ethics rules that our government tries to abide by when it comes to voluntary organ harvesting. It's you donate your organs, and that's why you have a long line of people when you need a liver transplant or any type of organ transplant in this country. It's not immediate. You have to wait months and months, and it's very scary for some people. But that's not the case in China. China, you can wait days, and you can get a perfect match for your organs. And people, the Falun Gong, they're a religious belief that was very popular in China up until 1999, and then they decided it was too popular and they would crack down on it because it was a threat to the communist control. It's a religious belief. It's sort of a meditative spiritual practice, and it has a lot of Buddhist elements to it. But there was a crackdown on that belief system, and as you know, there was a lot of protest in Washington about this around the 2003 to 2010. Got a lot of attention, and they said at the time that they were experiencing organ harvesting from prisoners, those practitioners of their belief that were imprisoned in China. And there was a lot of push to the side because that was when our country wanted to normalize trade relations with China, and they even supported China's entrance into the World Trade Organization. So there was a big movement to the, sort of a glasnost type period with China that they were going to change from within because they're going to have access to all of our technology and to our cars, and this is going to bring great change. Well, we know now that didn't happen. And President Xi has actually brought in a new era that hasn't been seen, a new crackdown on religion across the country. We've seen nearly 1 million Uyghurs put into labor camps, imprisoned, for no reason other than they are a Muslim ethnic minority. And they, too, now are experiencing the same type of organ harvesting that the Falun Gong experienced, and to it's actually a much greater scale.
Susan,
so
would you agree that the reason, I know it's very broad, but do you think it's fair to conclude, you said they became too popular. Did they become so popular that the Chinese Communist government said, this religious movement threatens our power? Is that the reason there was a crackdown?
Absolutely. There were some 70 million followers of the Falun Gong when this crackdown occurred. It corresponded, it was some years after the Tiananmen Square massacre. And we know that after that period, there was a lot of religious tolerance allowed. It wasn't sanctioned by the government, but it was allowed. These underground Christian house churches and Buddhism, as long as it was sanctioned by the Communist Party. But even those that weren't, there was a period where that was allowed. But now we're having a new movement. It's almost the more as severe, not as severe, but the most severe since the Cultural Revolution of Chairman Mao. So right after the communists got control, as you know, he sought to eradicate religion, said it was the opium of the masses, and attacked churches and temples and destroyed them, and we're seeing the same type of crackdown on religion now. You have they're using a national security law, a new one in Hong Kong, to go after retired bishops, 90-year-old popular retired bishops who helped protesters. We've seen that with Cardinal Zen, and also with Jimmy Lai. There's going to be a congressional committee tomorrow that's going to feature testimony from Jimmy Lai, who is a media entrepreneur and very wealthy individual that has been imprisoned before supporting pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. So we're seeing all kinds of crackdowns right now. If you talk to religious freedom advocates and human rights advocates across the world, they say this is a terrible time in China for practicing freedom of faith.
Susan, I'm talking to Susan Crabtree, who's a political correspondent, the White House reporter for Real Clear Politics. I want you to describe for my audience, because many people have heard, well, we've heard they cut organs out of living bodies, and they say, yeah. You hear a lot of things. These, the people you talk to actually looked at scientific papers run by the very surgeon or written by the very surgeons who had actually done the dirty deed, right?
That's right. For years, there was no evidence that we could really put our fingers on to prove all these accusations. But we had Mandarin-speaking researchers, very well respected, go through their very own public papers that they found in open sources, and found references to surgeries, transplant surgeries on prisoners, and then they found that in some cases those prisoners were not declared brain dead yet. And that's the really gruesome part of the story, is these are involuntary organ transplants, and sometimes these people are still alive to preserve the freshness of the organs.
Well, and in fact, some of the papers, as you wrote at Real Clear Politics, they show explicit descriptions of surgeries in which hearts are extracted from prisoners who are still alive. It wasn't just hinted at. The surgeon said, and here's how I cut the person open, and here's how I took the heart out while it was still beating.
Yes, there is one particular surgeon who I actually have spoken to. His name is Enver Todi. He has since immigrated to the United States, and he has said regrettably he was following orders. He didn't know he was going to go do a organ transplant, but he was told by the Communist Party officials to do this, and he performed regrettably the orders, and he has now testified before Congress about this, and also before tribunals in Britain and other places in Australia and elsewhere.
You got to read this story by Susan Crabtree. Susan, it's always a pleasure to have you on the program. Thanks so very much.
Really appreciate the interest and the time. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Susan Crabtree at Real Clear Politics, the White House reporter for that organization and the political correspondent, a story about how communist China, not just old wives' tales about taking beating hearts out of people who are still alive, who are political prisoners or religious prisoners, but actual documented evidence from the surgeons who did the cutting themselves, and describing how they took organs out of still living people and then transplanted them to others. This is outrageous. It's one of those things Joe Biden ought to be talking to Chairman Xi about, the dictator of communist China. Coming up, what do you do with a drug thug who's got enough fentanyl to kill a whole city? We'll talk about that next. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you on a Wednesday. Always glad to get your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. And if you're a naysayer, we'll put you right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. What are the chances that all three kids in one family are, as their mother describes them, queer? That's what Marcia Gay Harden, she's an Oscar-winning actress, and she described her kids that way, say all three of them. She said, what drives me is my children are all queer. My eldest child is non-binary. My son is gay. My youngest is fluid. And as you know, they are my kids, and they teach me every day. Well, good for her. But is that totally normal? Three kids in one family, or is it a product of indoctrination? I don't know. It's I would have to go with indoctrination, I think, rather than totally normal. I think that beats the odds any day of the week. So you can answer the question at Lars Larson Show or at larslarson.com. Brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believed in, so years ago I joined AMAC. You can do it too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC is better. Better for you and better for America. Yesterday's poll, Robert De Niro will be in his mid-90s when his latest child is a teenager. He's 79 now. He just had his seventh child, and I don't think that's fair for the kids. And frankly, the desires of adults to want to have children, that's a wonderful desire to have, as long as you're having the kids because they're a blessing and not because you want to satisfy whatever it is that you're trying to do. As I said, I've known people before who've used the birth of a child to try to glue together a bad relationship. Didn't work, by the way. That wasn't me, but I knew some people very, very well who had done exactly that. Our marriage is having troubles. Why don't we have a kid? Maybe that'll fix it. As I said, pro tip, doesn't work. So in that question, should anybody this old be making babies? 76% of you agreed with me and said no. Only 24% of you said yes to that idea. Couple of other quick mentions as well. New York City, I'm sure they're pleasing their local residents, is now shelling out $8 million a day to provide shelter for about 37,500 illegal aliens. That came up during a city council meeting in New York on Monday. On average, the city is projected to spend an average of $256 million to house each individual migrant per day. $256 to house each illegal alien every day. That's according to the Department of Homeless Services shelters. North Dakota has now banned preferred pronoun policies and strengthened parental rights. Governor Doug Burgum signed the bill on Monday. House Bill 1522 allows teachers, school officials, and government entities to ignore a student's preferred pronoun and ban hiding a student's transgender status from that student's parents. And in downtown San Francisco, where they've got lots and lots of illegal aliens and homeless, they now have 18.5 million square feet of empty office space, about 31% of all the available space in that city. It is empty, and that is bad news for that city. Let's go to Henry, listening on WCHV in Charlottesville. Hey, Henry, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind?
Well, I think Title 42 ended the day Joe Biden took office. I mean, we never had this many influx of people coming into town. I mean, our country. And Title 42, I mean, kept them out. But they have been enforcing Title 42 the whole time he's been there.
Well, in theory, I would say in practical terms, the minute Joe Biden became president, every sensible policy that kept illegal aliens out went out the window. Officially, it goes out of existence tomorrow, but you're right to a large extent. Although, let me point this out. If we define when did Title 42 end as when did the even bigger invasion of illegals begin, it began to ramp up a few days ago, even a couple of weeks ago. Tomorrow, they are expecting a tidal wave, more than 10,000 illegals per day crossing into the United States. So whether it officially ends tomorrow, but unofficially ended at the beginning of his term or not, the big influx, if you thought the 9 million who've come in already in the last not even 2.5 years was bad, it's going to get even worse starting tomorrow. Is that what you're aiming at?
Yes, sir. Exactly.
Okay. Anything else to say, Henry?
Well, I mean, it's just they haven't had no border security since the day he took office. So Title 42 really didn't mean anything when he was in the day he took office.
Yeah, you're right. You're right that for all intents and purposes, we've had no border security since Joe Biden took over, and that should bring something home, Henry, I think, to people in this country. If you say you're not a country if you don't have borders, and if you have borders but anybody can walk across them anytime they want, like some third world country, you're not really a country anymore. And Joe Biden has put us in that state. But you realize that Donald Trump demonstrated what he could do with already on the books laws. It would be nice to pass some new laws to straighten out a lot of this situation because they'd be valuable. We could handle the situation even better. But Donald Trump showed what could be accomplished with the existing laws and with existing resources. Joe Biden has shown that even in a country, a nation of laws, not a nation of men, as John Adams said, that even in a country with laws, if you have a feckless chief executive who really wants to wreck the country, he's capable of doing it, even though he took an oath to faithfully execute the laws of this country. I don't think anybody thinks that's happening. And frankly, I'm a bit not just disappointed, I'm angry at Republicans that they have not brought about articles of impeachment, because think of all the ways, even if you just count the big ones, that Joe Biden is wrecking this country. He's wrecking us with inflation. He's wrecking us with massive government spending. He's wrecking us in terms of energy. America was an energy independent country when he took over. We are no longer. We're now involved in a war that we shouldn't be in, spending hundreds of billions of dollars. We've now given a terrorist organization, the Taliban, tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons. He left behind Americans after explicitly promising not to do exactly that. I mean, you just go down the list of failures that he's had. Energy costs more, it's less available, and all that. Go ahead, sir.
He has not followed the Constitution in his administration. He has not followed the Constitution in many ways.
That's true. And in fact, think about all the times the courts in just 2.5, not even 2.5 years, have had to slap down Joe Biden when he said, we're going to use OSHA to push in a vaccine mandate. And you say, well, he can't do that legally. And the court said, you're right. He can't do that legally and lawfully under the Constitution. He has tried to do so many unconstitutional things. He wants to give away $500 billion to pay off student loans. And you say, does he have the authority to do that under law? And the answer is no, he does not. And yet, is he trying to do it anyway? Yes, he is. And can an American president erase our southern border and let anybody come in who wants to come in? Well, I don't know if he can, but he is right now. All true?
It's all true, and I think he should be impeached.
And now that they have the evidence that was rolled out this morning, about 6 o'clock in the morning this morning on the West Coast, where I am, I was watching that press conference, and I was thinking they now have bank documents that demonstrate that the Biden crime family has cleaned up to the tune of millions of dollars. And Joe Biden is clearly implicated in that because that's what they were selling. They were selling the influence of Vice President Joe Biden. And the end result of that, the Biden family gets rich and America gets wrecked. Back in a moment. All across the country, crime's been on the rise, but between social and political unrest and a worldwide pandemic, what would it take to actually take a bite out of that crime? We'll talk about that next. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. I'll confess that I'm kind of a law and order guy, not because I'm thrilled with every law out there. I mean, there's some of them that are kind of a pain in the backside, but I would like to see us have a law-abiding society and not an anarchist society, as the so-called Antifa folks seem to want. But around this country, we've had such a dramatic rise in violent crime, and it's so disturbing to see it. I'd like to see it solved. So Nino Marchese joins me now, who's director of the Criminal Justice and Civil Justice Task Force at ALEC, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council. Nino, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Lars.
So tell me, are you on a speakerphone by any chance, Nino? Do you mind if I ask?
No, I'm not. I have headphones in.
Okay, no, don't worry about it. I just want my audience to hear you. So what do we do about this problem? I've thrown out my ideas. I want to hear yours.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it right on the head. Americans are frustrated with it. We've seen a significant increase in violent crime, particularly starting at the peak of the pandemic back in 2020. And calls to defund the police are obviously not the solution. And so ALEC has recently teamed up with a coalition effort targeted to do exactly that and provide local and state level solutions to do so. And part of the four principles of this coalition, known as the Public Safety Solutions for America Coalition, the first one is to properly fund police. I can dive into that a little more. Other principles is to make sure that law enforcement are focusing their time and resources on solving serious violent crime, composed to other misdemeanors and lower level offenses. We also want law enforcement to focus on evidence-based practices that are proven to reduce violent crime and to enact further smarter crime policies. So a lot to throw out you there.
Well, there is a lot, but Nino, let me ask you this. Does any of that change the game if the political folks in charge, since most cities have a police chief who's not elected, he doesn't answer to the voters, he answers the politicians, that the politicians have to have the political will to say, we're willing to have the police arrest people, seek prosecution, indict people, a DA and a grand jury that are willing to actually bring charges, and courts that are willing to convict. And it seems like almost every piece of the system is broken. You've got politicians that say, oh, I don't want you to make traffic stops because we try, honestly, to be blunt about it, we stop too many people of color. And I say, I don't care who you're stopping. If you're stopping them for a legitimate reason and you happen to get a disproportionate share of one group or another, as long as the process is colorblind, I don't care. Charge people who are committing crimes with the crimes. And if you don't do traffic stops, then, traffic stops are where the cops find an awful lot of wanted criminals, wanted for much more serious things than speeding or making a wrong left turn or something like that. But if you don't have politicians that are willing to do that, does any of what you've suggested make a difference?
No, I think you bring up a really important point, particularly with poor policy guidance and prosecutors' offices, being hamstrung by those incentives and especially tighter budgets. I mean, we saw the murder rate shot up 34% between 2019 and 2022 nationally, or for a lot of the reasons that you're pointing out. So there needs to be pressure put on political leaders and law enforcement to get the results that we want. But I think there's a deeper issue here lying under everything you're talking about to compound on top of it, is that we're not utilizing our law enforcement in the best ways that we can. It's not that they're targeting the wrong things necessarily, but we need to support them in ways which fund them better and focus their efforts more so on violent crime. We point to cities like Dallas and Boston. Dallas recently enacted a violence reduction plan which focuses law enforcement on certain zones within a city that are known to be hotspots for criminal activity. This seems like common sense to everybody I talk to, an everyday American, to seasoned law enforcement, to state legislators, to U.S. congressmen. I mean, you want to target the hotspot areas that are known to have the most violent crime, rather than just looking to be out and, stopping somebody for traffic tickets just to collect revenue. It's not to say that they shouldn't be, enforcing the law in those ways, but if you have only 5% of your police forces solving, murder crimes, murder investigations, and that's not a good thing. And so Dallas saw murders decrease by 13% in 2021 and another 9% in 2022. Overall violent crime dropped by over 5.5% in 2022. Boston in the 90s, they enacted a program called Operation Ceasefire, where they also did similar law enforcement strategies to focus on those hotspots, and they saw similar effects. They saw decreased monthly youth homicides by 63%. So I think the main message that civilians and community members need to be, shouting really to their leaders and these politicians is that we want to best utilize law enforcement to target the most serious crimes.
I would agree with you. I mean, the only reason I mentioned traffic stops is because when you start pulling people over, you say, oh, you're wanted for rape, you're wanted for murder, you're wanted for something else. It's one of the best ways to catch bad guys. And enforcement on transit is another place that tends to produce a disproportionate share of wanted criminals. And then you take them, because otherwise they run around and they just think, well, nobody's stopping me. Here I am wanted on 4 or 5 warrants, and nobody bothers to do anything. I'm talking to Nino Marchese, who's director of the Criminal Justice and Civil Justice Task Force at ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. But you also hit on something I think is really important, and that is focus on the parts of town where you have the biggest kind of problem. Maybe it's burglary over here, maybe it's rape over there, maybe it's we have a lot of murders over here. The problem is, Nino, without even looking at a particular city, would you guess that those areas are disproportionately low income and disproportionately people of color?
I mean, I don't think it's anybody's stretch of the imagination that those areas would be areas of disproportionate income levels. I mean, there's certainly a very strong correlation between lower income levels, specifically poverty-ridden levels, and criminal activity.
Yep.
It doesn't mean that you're targeting poor people necessarily. You're targeting the areas with the most violent crime. And these are data-backed, evidence-backed approaches that have had resounding success in various municipalities all across the country. I listed Boston previously. Dallas is currently doing this now. Miami is taking up this effort. I mean, it's not unique to any municipality. It's all over where you have these hotspots. So as far as disproportionately affecting people, I don't think so, and I think there's nobody who could justifiably criticize that policing practice. We want the people, the dangerous criminals who are committing, violent crime, found and tried accordingly with due process, but ultimately brought to justice.
Yep. And by the way, Nino, I know from talking to the cops and criminologists, they'll tell you criminals tend to prey on the very neighborhoods that they live in. So if it's a low-income neighborhood, the people who get hurt the worst are those who can least afford to deal with the consequence. That's Nino Marchese from the American Legislative Exchange Council, and this is the Lars Larson Show.
The Bidens have received millions of dollars from China. It is inconceivable that the president did not know it.
That is Congressman James Comer from the great Commonwealth of Kentucky, just one of the many members of Congress who, just a few hours ago, laid out the evidence against the Biden crime family and against Joe Biden in particular. I want to talk about that evidence. I want to talk about what it says about Joe Biden and, of course, what it says implicitly about the Republicans who need to grow a spine and impeach this president for his high crimes and misdemeanors. Welcome to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to get to your phone calls and emails. So let me explain how that works. 866-HEY-LARS. And if you're a naysayer, you go right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. You can send emails to talk@larslarson.com. Find our brand new Twitter poll question, 2 places every day, and a brand new question every day out of the news of the day. Find it at Lars Larson Show on Twitter and at larslarson.com on our website. Welcome to the Radio Northwest Network, too, serving the Pacific Northwest states of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho for the past 23-plus years. Glad to have you with me. Now, I want to talk about the Biden crime family, but I'll admit, I still remember when I was a teenager, almost 50 years ago, political dirty tricks, a third-rate burglary, and, of course, a White House cover-up that brought down a president by the name of Richard Milhouse Nixon. Well, this morning, half a dozen members of the U.S. Congress, all of them Republicans, documented the bank records they have now subpoenaed that show $10 million in payments from citizens of foreign countries, foreign nationals, to a complicated web of companies and cutouts and LLCs designed to hide the monies paid to 9 Biden family members and clearly implicating President Joe Biden. Bank records show the Biden family got $10 million in payments from China. There were also payments from Ukraine. There were payments from Romania. There were payments from many countries on planet Earth. And James Comer gave some of the details about the money from China.
President Biden has claimed since the 2020 election that his family has not received money from China. That was a lie in 2020, and he continues to lie to the American people now. The Bidens have received millions of dollars from China. It is inconceivable that the president did not know it. The White House refuses to correct the president's statements, showing the president is now using the federal government to run interference for his families and his own role in these schemes.
Now, I got to tell you something. It needs to occur to you. If something was being sold by Hunter Biden, by the president's brother, James Biden, or by other members of the family who didn't even seem to be directly involved, they were just a pathway to pay those dollars in a way that tried to hide what was going on. But you might want to ask yourself this. What did the Biden family have to sell? I mean, Hunter Biden kicked out of the U.S. Navy Reserve for cocaine problems, fathering a child with a stripper that he denied for a long time, and all of his many trips to China with dear old dad on Air Force Two when dad was vice president of the United States. They didn't have anything to sell. They're not really in business unless you count politics as a business, pointed out by Florida member of Congress Byron Donalds.
There's one thing everybody in this room and the American people definitely know is that the Biden family doesn't really have a business. There is no business structure around this family except politics. And since Joe Biden has spent decades in the Senate, served 8 years as vice president, and is now president of the United States, and the family's getting money from various countries and foreign businesses through various shell companies and this web of LLCs, I mean, guys, you in the press, this is easy pickings. I'm giving you Pulitzer stuff here.
Now, that's Byron Donalds. And he points out, I know somebody's going to bring up Donald Trump. Well, Donald Trump made lots of money. In point of fact, During his time as president of the United States, Donald Trump's net worth dropped, not just according to him, but according to everybody who looked at his business. His net worth actually went down by about $1 billion. And that's despite the fact that, as Byron Donalds points out, Donald Trump actually did have a business.
Former president actually had a business, very big business. You could say it was his name. You could say it was his buildings. You could say it was wine. You could say it was branding. You could say it was The Apprentice. But he had a very big and legitimate business, which everybody in this room clearly knows and understands and can point to and say, that's the thing, that thing over there. Joe Biden has no business except his position in politics.
So at this press conference just a few hours ago, representatives showed that some of the deals were cut while Joe Biden sat in the vice president's office. And that's a very important point, because there are going to be people say, oh, no, he got all that money after he left office as vice president before he became president of the United States. Deals that meant millions of dollars from a Chinese energy company. That certainly explains most of Joe Biden's current energy policy for America. Lock up the vast energy reserves that this country has been blessed with in the name of climate change. Just lock them up. And then force Americans to buy solar panels, windmills, and electric cars, all of them from, guess where? China. This makes Watergate look like chump change by comparison. And it should end the same way, with Joe Biden tottering out of the White House in disgrace. Listen to Member of Congress Nancy Mace about the implications for the Biden family.
The Biden family needs to answer for this. And the DOJ needs to get off its ass and investigate. We've done the work for them so they can't screw it up now. If these allegations, any of these allegations, are proven true, then someone with the last name Biden needs to be charged, prosecuted, and maybe spend a little time in prison to take to account and responsible for the actions they've taken today.
Now, the Biden family and its business associates did this. They had about 4 companies before Joe Biden became vice president. During his vice presidency, they created 16 more shell companies, according to the bank records obtained by the House Oversight Committee, a system that GOP lawmakers say was meant to conceal the money that they got from foreign nationals. Listen again to Florida Member of Congress Byron Donalds about Joe Biden.
Cycling through this many companies serves no legitimate purpose. And as somebody who actually worked in banking, I did that long before I came here. Whenever there was like this many companies just laying all over the place, and you see wire transfers and cashier checks over here going to random members of the family for no apparent purpose at the size and velocity at which all of this was being conducted, the only logical conclusion of a financial professional is you are concealing money.
Now, let me go back to Watergate. Remember what Watergate was? It was one political party stealing information from another, and that's criminal, and it shouldn't have happened. There was even a little bit of attempted wiretapping, and of course there was the White House cover-up. Now compare that to an American president compromised by foreign countries, including, most importantly, China, and about the actions Joe Biden has taken to cripple America in its energy supply and then demand that the rest of us as citizens have to buy our energy supply and our automobiles from China because he got paid off. And Republicans need to grow a backbone and bring up articles of impeachment. Back in just a moment on this Wednesday. Glad to have you with me. You're listening to the Lars Larson Show and the Radio Northwest Network. That's right, they do. And if you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. If you happen to be a naysayer, that is, you disagree with my point of view or the things you hear on this show, why, you're more than welcome. We put you right to the head of the line. If you'd rather email, it's talk@larslarson.com. And if you'd like to cast a vote in our Twitter poll, we put up a brand new question every day at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Vote doesn't cost anything. Might be habit forming, but that's okay. I want to talk about critical race theory, and Jen Cabani joins me now, who's an editor with the College Fix. Jen, welcome back to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Is there any doubt about how most Americans feel about the idea of pushing critical race theory, which I would sum up as white people are the dominant power in America, and that their dominance has been at the expense of people of color, and that if you're a person of color, you are incapable of correcting that on your own without the assistance of your friends, usually from the Democrat Party, and that it's very debilitating for both white and black and brown people altogether. How do most Americans feel about that?
I think most Americans, and I'm saying white Americans, black Americans, Latino Americans, and all Americans are sick and tired of this mantra that we're all systemically racist, unconsciously racist, purposely racist, that our laws are racist, that our institutions are racist. I mean, it's 2023. We are so post-racist. It's unbelievable. And we're not going to buy this anymore.
I would agree with you. In fact, I had a friend of mine, Nick, who told me, he said, yeah, somebody was bothering him about this, saying, well, you don't understand. You grew up with white privilege. He said, my mom had mental health problems. My dad was a mill worker. There was no white privilege in my family. And he's done very, very well since then. But he didn't get there because he had, as the woman accused him of, generational wealth. He said, my dad, the mill worker, he would have laughed at generational wealth. I mean, there's a lot of mythology that's used to push this stuff.
Absolutely. And I think parents really, they've been awoken. The sleeping giant has awoken in 2020 when everybody had to take school at home. And the parents are like, what are they teaching you? What are they telling you? I worked my butt off, man. I mean, a lot of these children come from very, very poor, areas. Their parents are, latchkey kids because their parents are working two jobs just trying to make ends meet. And then they got to tell them that they're privileged and they're racist. I mean, come on.
No, in fact, I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, which is now, it's hard to believe, 3 years ago, right about this time, 3 years ago, there was a piece of audio that we played. They went with a video, but the video was of a Philadelphia teacher. It was a black woman who was screaming and yelling at this meeting. She was a teacher because she said, you can't let the parents see what we're teaching, because they were about to introduce remote learning, what we now call remote learning. And she said, we can't let the parents see what we're teaching. And now we know why she was so afraid of that, because parents would look at it and, as you said, say, you're teaching my kid what? I mean, whether it had to do with sex or race or privilege or this or that or the other thing, the teachers literally knew that what they were pushing on the kids was not going to be favorably, received by the parents. And they said, you got to keep them in the dark the way they have been the last couple of years, not let them know what we're teaching.
Yeah. And America has spoken. So we have an article on the College Fix today that reports on this analysis that folks at UCLA did. And they found that every U.S. state, except for one, Delaware, has introduced measures to combat critical race theory inside classrooms, whether that is a attorney general letter, some sort of executive directive, legislation, or a policy, or a resolution, or a statement. But, across America, across the board, people are saying, no, enough.
Now, Jen, I got to ask you something. Is there a strange kind of irony that a well-known U.S. senator from the state of Delaware, who was one of the biggest racists based on his own statements and his own actions for decades, is now sitting in the White House, and Delaware is the only state that doesn't have an anti-CRT measure? You know what?
Unfortunately, I'm a sucker for most conspiracy theories. So I think you might be onto something, but only a matter of time before parents in Delaware wake up too. I mean, look, these classrooms are toxic. They're teaching garbage that are dividing our children under the guise of unity and inclusion. It's not bringing kids together. It's not unifying them. It's tearing them apart and making them enemies. And I think we're just tired of Americans are just tired of this poison. Look, we have enough trouble keeping food on our table and the lights on in this horrible economy. The last thing we need is, telling little Johnny and little Sally all the way up from kindergarten to college that they're racist.
See, and the thing that bothers me, Jen, is before the practical result, which is, well, how do a bunch of kids react to this when the teacher says, yeah, these white kids over here, they're part of the problem, and their parents are too. And these black kids over here and the brown kids over there, you folks are incapable of bettering your situation because of the dominance of all these white kids and their parents. You're incapable. We're going to define you, and we're defining you based on the color of your skin. I always thought that was an idea we threw out a long, long time ago, didn't we?
You know what? You hit the nail on the head. I mean, this is a soft bigotry of low expectations, trying to tell people that they can't do it because of the color of their skin. It's insulting and it's flat out wrong. And the thing that makes me even more upset is when there's, Black conservatives, Latino conservatives, and they're called all sorts of names by the left. I mean, to tell a Black conservative they're racist is probably one of the most insulting things you can do. And yet, time and time again, their opinions are dismissed. Sometimes I feel like the left's the most racist of all.
I think they are. And one of the other things that bothers me about this is I'm proud of the positions I take on issues. I mean, I know that not everybody agrees with them, but if somebody comes to me and says, "You're a conservative, aren't you?" I say, "You're damn right. You own guns, don't you?" "Yes, I do. And I handle them all legally and lawfully." But when you go to liberals and you say, "You're backing CRT," they'll say, "No, CRT doesn't exist. It's not being taught anywhere except colleges and law schools. We deny its very existence." Even if you've got to deny the existence of some nonsense you're pushing, it's probably because you know that people won't like it.
Well, these are the same people that try to tell us a man is a woman and a woman is a man. So, I mean, I take it with a grain of salt, right? Because right now we're living in a world where, white is black, up is down, left is right. I mean, they're just trying to feed us lies after lies. It's so Orwellian. Sometimes I can't believe the state of America.
I never thought I would get to that, but war is peace, freedom is slavery, quoting from Orwell's famous book. But now we're seeing what happens when you get down to the actual and literal retail level. And you say, hey, Bud Light has gone woke. And the company has lost 25% of its entire sales in the first quarter of this year. And the other Bud brands, the other Anheuser-Busch brands, are also just getting shellacked. They're getting whacked because everybody who's heard this says, "I'm not buying that stuff, and I'm not buying your sister beers either." Do you think that perhaps corporate America, which has embraced all this woke stuff and the CRT stuff and the DEI stuff, might just take a look at what's happening to Anheuser-Busch as they start to founder because of all this and say, maybe this woke stuff is not all it's cracked up to be?
I really wish I could say, yes, they're going to wake up. I always tell all of my peers and friends, vote with your wallet. And you look at, movies that are conservative and do so well, and sometimes we are able to teach these companies a lesson. But for some reason, it just seems that time and time again, corporate America is making the wrong decisions, and they're shoving this down our throats. And once in a while, we get them back. But the tide it's like a huge tidal wave, sometimes it feels like. And I don't mean to be a pessimist or a cynic, but I have a feeling it's going to keep coming up.
Jen Kabani is an editor of the College Fix. You can check out the latest piece there about how the anti-CRT stuff is pushing hard, and that's good to hear. Jen, thanks very much. I appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Always glad to have Jen Kabani from the College Fix. Glad to get your calls, too, at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Haven't had a good naysayer today. I'd love to know if somebody says, "Oh, no, CRT is great. We should define people by the color of their skin." I'd love to hear that naysayer. You can find it, and glad to have you with me on the Lars Larson Show and the Radio Northwest Network. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I always have a lot of fun when I bring Jim Banks on, who's member of Congress from the great state of Indiana, representing the 3rd Congressional District there, and the Republican Study Committee chair. How you doing, Chair Banks?
Hey, I'm doing well, sir. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I got to ask you first about this debt ceiling limit, because for the life of me, I can't understand. We've got old sound bites of Joe Biden where he said, well, you have to negotiate. It's all about negotiating when it comes to the debt ceiling. And now that he's sitting in the Oval Office, like, no, I'm not talking about anything. You give me more room on the giant national Visa card, and don't ask me to cut spending. We'll do that later on. Does any of this make sense to you?
No, it doesn't make sense. And it's just another pathetic example of how awful of a president Joe Biden really is for this country. I mean, the whole point of Congress, the legislative branch of the government, it is a negotiation. You don't always get what you want, no matter what side you're on. So Republicans passed I think what was a very modest debt limit increase bill a couple of weeks ago. Would increase the debt limit $1.5 trillion, but cut $5 trillion, cap spending, work requirements for food stamps, scale back all of the Green New Deal subsidies and mandates to bring down energy costs in America. And you got President Biden saying that the only thing he will sign is just what he calls a clean debt limit increase. So that's not going to cut it. The American people are looking for leadership today more than ever to address a $32 trillion national debt, and that's what the House Republicans and our majority is focused on, providing that type of leadership. And so far, President Biden is refusing to negotiate or do anything about it.
So, Congressman Beggs, a couple of hours ago, the president, and he laid it out that it's the MAGA Republicans. I would consider myself a MAGA Republican, but I assume you'd be in the same kind of camp, saying we're not giving you a debt ceiling increase until you actually agree to cut some spending. It seems like such a reasonable, request to say we're spending it's almost $32 trillion, I think, if I know the number right. It's just shy of that. And he wants another couple of trillion to spend and says, yeah, later on. I mean, it's like the fat guy saying, I'm going on a diet as soon as I eat this big piece of chocolate cake. I don't trust them to cut spending.
Yeah, I don't either, Lars. I mean, this administration, this president has spent more money than any president in American history. Over the last couple of years, the government has spent more money than any government in the history of the world. And you look at what they spend it on. I mean, I'm shocked by the things that this administration comes up with to spend money on. $200 million to the State Department's Gender Equity Fund, $8.6 million on gender programs at the Department of Defense, $34 million at the Department of Veteran Affairs to stop climate change. I mean, you start adding up 10 million here, 100 million there, 50 million over here for all of these woke causes, and pretty soon you get into the billions, and then you get into the trillions. So there is a wide array of options of where to cut wasteful spending, especially on radical woke line items like a couple of them that I just mentioned, and that's where we've got to start. But this president refuses to budge. He doesn't want to cut spending because the socialist Democrats believe that more spending is what leads this country over the fiscal cliff and into a socialist country, which is their end goal.
By the way, let's talk about woke for a moment, if you don't mind. Is woke wrecking America's military? And then please talk about the specific example at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy.
Yeah, I mean, this is I think, a sad state of affairs and an example of where we are in this country today. I mean, I'm tangling with the United States Navy, and Lars, you know, I'm a veteran of the United States Navy Reserve. I served in Afghanistan. I wore the uniform. You know, last week my office uncovered that the Navy apparently they didn't learn the lesson from Bud Light because they hired a transgender activist to market for recruitment at a time when they're way off their recruitment goals. They go and think they can send a transgender activist on Instagram and recruit more Navy sailors. It's not going to work for the Navy like it didn't work for Bud Light. So you got example after example of that kind of activity in the military. But I've been, I didn't know a whole lot about the U.S. Merchant Marines and the Academy, the very important role that they play in logistics and the transporting of American goods. 75% of goods in the United States are transported by sea. So the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy pumps out leaders to go serve in that industry, and not just in a logistical standpoint, but to keep America's logistics working and safe and to keep us secure. And I've had some parents of Merchant Marines at the Academy reach out to me and talk about a couple of things going on there. The first thing that they reached out to me about was, by the way, this is all under the Department of Transportation governs the Merchant Marine Academy.
Oh,
and
great!
Guess who's in charge of the
Pete
Department
Buttigieg.
of Transportation?
Yeah.
Pete
I'm
Buttigieg.
sorry. I'm sorry to say he's a product of Indiana, but I know you don't claim him probably these days. So.
Lars, he just moved to Michigan, so he's no longer a Hoosier. He's a Michigander, so he's their problem now. But he ordered the covering up of a historic painting at the Merchant Marine Academy. It's been there since the founding of the Academy. The historic Christ on the Water painting that was a beautiful painting of Jesus Christ. They covered it up. It's still covered up with a blanket as a display of anti-Christian activism at the Merchant Marine Academy. All the while, they have a large LGBTQ display in the foyer when you walk into the academy, but they've covered up a beautiful painting of Jesus Christ. So that was my first introduction to wokeism creeping into what's going on there. And then secondly, we just heard about this, the sexual assault response director at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy has multiple times tweeted anti-male tweets calling white men the root of all of society's problems.
Yeah.
He's turning the anti-sexual assault efforts at the academy into a woke crusade against white males. It's sickening. It's a sign of the times, a sign of the woke radical agenda. We've got to stop it.
No, in fact, the quote from him, this Tripolsky guy, says misogyny and racism grow from the same white male root. Well, frankly, look, I as a reporter, I've covered lots of stories about violence against women. Believe me, domestic violence or any of those other awful crimes are not committed exclusively or even predominantly by white males. It's and racism. Listen, racism comes from every corner of the community, including black and brown members of the community who engage in racist behavior. I'm glad that you're pushing back against this woke stuff because it sounds like it's just wrecking things. And I'm glad you brought up Anheuser-Busch. I was just looking at a report that says that company has lost something like 25% of its nationwide sales. It's now being downgraded by people saying, don't buy the stock, stay away from it. I mean, that company is in big trouble. And apparently it's spread far beyond Bud Light. It's all the other Anheuser-Busch brands are taking a beating from it as well. By the way, where can people find your Senate campaign online?
Well, we're up to a great start running for Senate in the great state of Indiana. Go to banksforsenate.com and get involved. The election isn't until next year, Lars, but I'm doing my part to help win back the Senate Republican majority so we can save this country. And you can get involved no matter if you're in Indiana or not, banksforsenate.com.
And we'll be glad to help you out, Congressman Banks. That's Congressman Jim Banks, the Republican Study Committee chair from the great state of Indiana, running now for the U.S. Senate from Indiana. We'll be back in a moment. You're listening to the Lars Larson Show and the Radio Northwest Network.
This is a manufactured crisis. There's no question about America's ability to pay its bills. America has the strongest economy in the world, and we should be cutting spending and lowering the deficit without a needless crisis.
That is Joe Biden speaking just a few hours ago about the debt ceiling. You see, Congress has a limit on how much money it can borrow, and I think they're perfectly appropriate in setting that limit. And now the White House wants that debt ceiling lifted because we've only run ourselves into almost $32 trillion in debt, and Joe would like to spend another couple of $1 trillion. And then he makes a bunch of false claims about it. But he told this audience in this speech he gave just a few hours ago, he said, this is a needless crisis. We're going to cut spending. You just have to give me some more room on the company credit card so I can borrow a lot more money. And when I say a lot, I mean trillions of dollars. And then after we've got that extra room, then we're going to cut spending. Well, that's not the way it's going to go. And I hope that Kevin McCarthy, the House Speaker, sticks to his guns and says, Mr. President, we will give you an increase in borrowing authority in the Congress, which has the authority to limit borrowing, but we will only do it when you agree to actually reduce the amount of spending. Now, Joe Biden so far has said he's not willing to cut that kind of deal, except at the same time he says, yeah, I'll bring about some cuts in spending. That'll happen. Just give me the extra borrowing authority first, because without that, I mean, the president doesn't actually spend money anyway. The Congress, under our Constitution, only the Congress can authorize spending. Now, once it's authorized by the Congress, the man who executes it, or woman, is the President of the United States, because they run the executive branch of government. But the authorization to spend comes in what's called it's a bill, it's a law that becomes an appropriation. You appropriate money. And in this case, Joe Biden wants to borrow another couple of $1 trillion. And in that speech, Joe Biden made it very clear where he's headed this year as he campaigns for re-election next year, something I don't think is very likely. And the polls agree with me. Donald Trump's going to get the nomination from the Republicans. That's almost certain according to the polls today. Now, next summer is a long ways away. And then next fall, the only candidate among all the Republican candidates, according to the polls today, who can beat Joe Biden is going to be Donald Trump. That's not me saying it. That's what the polls say. But Joe Biden has very clearly decided that about half of America, those who identify as Make America Great Again people, like I do, I agree with Donald Trump. We should make America great again. But Joe Biden tries to cast us as the enemy. Take a listen to what he said just a couple of hours ago.
There's a very extreme wing of the Republican Party, and the House of Representatives refer to themselves now. I've been calling them this for a while, but now they refer to themselves as the MAGA Republicans. And they've taken control of the House. They're literally, not figuratively, holding the economy hostage by threatening to default on our nation's debt we've already incurred over the last couple hundred years, unless we give in to their threats and demands as to what they think we should be doing with regard to the budget.
Yeah, so much of that is wrong. He says the debts we've already incurred. Yes, we have to pay the interest on the debts we've already incurred. Do you realize America today, just to pay the interest on the money we've already borrowed, is spending well over $1 billion per day on interest costs? Now, if you don't believe me, look the number up. And we're forecast within about 3 years to spend more money just paying the interest costs of all that borrowing over the last several decades, not over the last couple of hundred years, because the debt used to be relatively small. To just give you a little history trip, when Barack Hussein Obama came in as president, America's national debt was $10 trillion, less than 1/3 of what it is today. You say, well, what was it when Obama left? It was $20 trillion. It was twice as big. Now, I will admit Obama had to deal with the 2008 financial crash. So it was $10 trillion when he came in, $20 trillion when he left. When Trump came in, it was about $20 trillion. And then it was very close to $30 trillion when Trump left. But Joe Biden has been spending like a drunken sailor. Now, Joe Biden loves to brag, and I'll play the soundbite of him bragging in a moment. He loves to brag, I'm the first president who's lowered the deficit. Well, that's a falsehood. In the first 7 months of the fiscal year, the federal fiscal year starts October 1, ends September 31. In the first 7 months, he ran a $928 billion deficit, 0.9 trillion dollars in 7 months. And yet he brags about lowering the deficit. Take a listen to that.
I'm the only president in history that's lowered the deficit in those 2 years by a record $1.7 trillion. $1.7 trillion. And the budget I proposed back in March would cut the deficit again by nearly $3 trillion in the decade ahead.
I got to tell you something. Let me explain to you how Joe Biden can claim to have cut the deficit. During the COVID emergency, for right or wrong, the government spent a ton of money in 2020. So Congress authorized massive amounts of money to be spent. That was stimulus payments, extra payments for those who are unemployed, personal PPP loans, by the way, which I didn't take any of those, PPP loans or grants as they became later. So you say during an emergency, you spend a lot of money. This, where Joe Biden's saying, I've cut the deficit is the amount of money you spend beyond what you bring in. So if you're a guy or gal who makes $5,000 a month, but you spend $6,000 a month, you have a $1,000 monthly deficit. You are short of what you're spending by $1,000. At the national level, if you spend more than the government takes in, that is the deficit. So what Joe Biden is saying is, in an emergency, when Congress did extraordinarily authorized spending during mostly in 2020, a little bit in 2021, that when those laws for all that extra spending ran out, he gets to take credit for that as cutting government spending. No, he doesn't, because it was during an emergency. It would be like if your wife and you were talking about how your family budget was starting to get bigger than the amount of money you make every month. And then a big storm hits and all the windows in your house are blown out. That's the pandemic. And so you go out and you spend, in 1 month, you spend thousands of dollars to replace all those windows. And then the following month, you don't have to replace all the windows. And you say to your wife, why, I've cut our family spending dramatically. Look how much we spent in March when you had to replace all the windows. And then look how little we spent in April. We've cut our family spending. No, you haven't. What you've done is let all that crazy spending that Congress did during the pandemic year, the first year of the pandemic, expire. You're not doing it anymore because we're not in a pandemic anymore. And that's what Joe Biden takes credit for. And then he suggests that we've got to pay our bills even if we have to borrow ourselves into oblivion because we're not deadbeats. Listen to that.
Over the last decade, the single largest contribution to the debt, aside from the pandemic, were the Trump tax cuts skewed to the wealthy and large corporations for $2 trillion. It made it clear, I made it clear, America is not a deadbeat nation. We pay our bills.
You pay your bills with borrowed money. Now, I just ask you this. If you had a friend who said, and you said, are you really doing okay? You managed to pay all your bills? He goes, yeah, I just put them all on my Visa card. Would you say, well, that doesn't seem very sensible to pay all your bills with borrowed money? That's what Joe Biden says. We're not deadbeats because we're borrowing enough money, mortgaging our future for our grandkids and great-grandkids. We're borrowing enough money to pay our bills, so that makes us not a deadbeat. I think Joe Biden is a deadbeat every day of the week, and he ought to be impeached for this nonsense. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show.